Hello everyone. Some of you may have already seen, I know some of you were at VARC and different conferences, so some of you might have seen bits of this project before, but it's constantly evolving, so hopefully there'll be something new for everyone. For some reason the top of it's cut off, so hopefully the next few slides will be a bit, but if anything's off the screen I can let you know about it. But this is about vegan versus plant-based, and the versus is in inverted commas because I'm not too sure whether it should be so antagonistic, but we'll discuss that as we go. I'm going to have to try and remember to stay next to the lectern because I tend to walk around when I'm doing my lectures. So these were our basic research questions. The first one seems fairly simple, but it leads into something a lot more theoretical and fundamental, I feel, which is how are consumers, brands and other market actors using these terms? And then what does that tell us about the kinds of ways that we think about animal consumption behind the scenes? So the ideas and the ideals that we have, which I use the word ideology. I know that's kind of a very charged term, but that's just the kind of simplest one that I found to use. And the background to this really is if you look at the data, people are talking a lot more about veganism than they are about plant-based. But when you look at the kinds of newspaper articles and the public discourse that we have around this, it seems to be that, you know, veganism is really extreme. Veganism is very polarizing. And there's a lot of newspaper articles about the vegan bubble bursting. And in comparison, plant-based seems to be this kind of safe, soft option. People are mixing vegan and non-vegan products together. They're identifying as flexitarian, climatarian, whatever you want to use. But at the same time, people are saying that veganism is kind of coming of age and it's becoming cool and it's kind of becoming more culturally acceptable to be vegan. So we've got a lot of conflicting discourse out there. And if we go back to the previous presentation, we wanted a little bit more of an evidence base about actually what is going on here, because it seems to be in a state of flux. And when we're in a state of flux, that's usually the most interesting time for an academic to get involved. I'll whiz through this, but the theory base is basically that, and I was saying this to some people earlier, you know, as a consumer research, we often talk to consumers a lot, but trying to convince individual consumers takes a lot of time. Actually moving a little bit upstream and talking to the brands, the policymakers, and the people who shape the choice architectures that determine what consumers can do is kind of a much more powerful way in tandem with consumers. So brands aren't always the enemy, they can also be partners, and we need to have conversations about them because they are consumers. So the way that they think about veganism is really important in shaping about how the consumers downstream are going to think about veganism. So this research looks for patterns in the ways that we're talking about veganism, in the emotions or non-emotions that are being used and the practices as well, and then trying to use that to get at the underlying ideas behind veganism, plant-based and other terms, and to see where we have these points of synergy and these points of conflict. So I just define ideals plus power as ideology. And the point of this research is to sniff out for the patterns behind the discourse. I think some of you saw this slide before, so sorry about that. But so if we look at what people are saying about veganism and plant-based, we can get an insight into how they think about veganism and plant-based brands, which is kind of fairly obvious. There's obviously a relationship between them, not a perfect one. But then how people then enact those in the marketplace is going to really drive the infrastructural changes that we need. It's not just about how people feel about veganism, plant-based, plant-curious, and all these other terms. It's about whether they act on them and actually drive markets in a much more favourable direction. So the research that we're doing here is called a sentiment analysis, but I want to be really clear, I'm not approaching this from a kind of big data perspective. So there's two types of sentiment analysis. I put them in a table here. If you want to read them, we could talk about this later. But the one on the right here is what I'm doing. So traditionally, when we do sentiment analysis, we get huge amounts of data and we get a computer to work out whether people are happy or sad about something, which has its uses. It's very quantitative, it's very positivist. But what you get there is breadth. You don't necessarily get depth. So breadth can be useful if we want to look for big patterns, but what we're trying to understand here is some very subtle differences. So we've gone for a much more qualitative, critical, interpretive approach. And our approach isn't really just to predict and manipulate people. Our approach is to understand people and to interpret what they're doing in order to then empower them to make better choices. And so the key point here is that we're not just looking whether things are happy or sad. We're looking to understand what the meanings are behind these different uses and how they're kind of charged in complex ways. And so what this involves is a human ethnographer, an online ethnographer, who actually immerses themselves in the context and tries to bring that human interpretation. I know there's been a lot of advances in AI, but we're not quite there yet with the level of interpretation that large language models can do. So rather than scanning and aggregating, this is about kind of getting that subtle sense. And I'll just give you an example. You know, if a computer read Harris is brats, they'd probably code that as negative. The word brat is negative, but of course we all know that brat is kind of being used in a positive way here. Or if someone says, if I lose my iPhone, I'll die, you have to code the computer to know that that's not obviously a very negatively charged sentiment necessarily. It could be kind of more ambiguous. Whereas obviously human intelligence is a bit slower and has its biases, but it does have its advantages. So we're very much approaching it from this perspective on the right and now left. So we're looking for consistency in the patterns. We're looking for variance in the patterns. You know, one person might use the word vegan in a completely different way to another. And then we're looking for kind of these illustrative examples, which I'm going to show you in a moment. I'll just whiz through this, but just to give you a sense, this is the model that I've been using in terms of what the ethnography is. It involves being immersed in that context. So as a vegan myself, obviously I'm kind of immersed by default, but I've been doing a lot more research on veganism and plant-based recently, and I've learned a lot more about how other people think about it, which has been a big surprise for me. I've interviewed over 50 different people, but 23 of them, I think now, and growing, are brand managers, people who own or run vegan or plant-based brands, so trying to get their perspectives. And then what I've been looking for to show you is these kind of key archipelago data points. If we think about the market, the vegan plant-based market as this kind of very complex field, there's no way I can kind of show you everything at once. But what I can do is kind of pick out those islands, those very salient islands of meaning that kind of give you an insight into that. So the findings part one, this was actually shown in the report that we just discussed. This is what brands think about the terms vegan and plant-based. I don't know how much time have I got, I might be overrunning. For vegan or plant-based brands, there's kind of three main approaches. There's labeling their products as vegan, very prominently, and this kind of sheds a spotlight on animals. If you use the word vegan, you're very clearly focusing on animals as kind of the key focus or issue in your branding. Those who use plant-based, it's more like an eclipse in the sense that you can kind of infer or guess that they might be thinking about animals or talking about animals, but it's not explicitly spoken about. Usually plant-based brands are sustainable or health-focused. Animals are maybe the third or the fourth issue. And there is generally a shift or a perceived shift away from vegan branding towards plant-based. But as I'll show you, it's not that simple. There's obviously a third option, which is you can use both. You might say plant-based on the front, and then in tiny font on the back, you can say vegan as well, or suitable for vegans. Or you can use the vegan trademark, but maybe not use veganism in your branding so prominently. So you can kind of have a mixed approach. For those brands who use vegan, the key reason there is that they are personally passionate about animal liberation, so they want to get the word out there. They want people to be thinking and talking about veganism whilst in the supermarket. Okay, so that's kind of the fairly obvious approach. But for many people, they feel like it's a high-risk approach because not everyone identifies as vegan, so people might think, oh, that's not for me because I'm not a vegan, okay, and they might not pick up that item. So it's commercially risky, but it's also culturally risky. Some people feel like if you kind of have a direct attack on people's values, they might be more resistant to it. So there is also this argument about this kind of indirect approach. But at the same time, some brands are arguing that actually just kind of having the word vegan everywhere just has this kind of subconscious normalization. So basically, the brands aren't really sure what to do. And some brands I spoke to who aren't based in the UK, so speaking about cultural differences, for example, one brand based in India was talking about different terms that they would use that predate the vegan term, and therefore they kind of see veganism as this kind of cultural imperialism being imposed on them from the West. But of course, there's also this idea that vegan is very well translated. So, you know, in Italian it's vegano, in French or in Spanish or in almost any language you can just use the word vegan and it makes sense. It doesn't have this kind of, you don't have to necessarily translate it. Whereas when you translate plant-based into different languages, they literally translate the word plant and based, and that can kind of be very clunky. So again, we're not really sure whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And there's also a lot of these brands that are talking about being accidentally vegan. You know, it's like, I don't know if you've ever picked up a can of tomatoes, but if that's branded as vegan, it's like, well, okay, it is vegan, of course, but kind of by default. But there's a lot of brands out there that are like, yeah, we're vegan, you know. Whereas there's this kind of happening to be vegan discourse emerging as well. So on the plant-based side, the fairly obvious story here is, you know, like, vegans will pick it up anyway because it is vegan, it just isn't so prominently discussed, but non-vegans will maybe also pick it up, so it's a win-win, basically. This is the safe option, right? Let's just not call it vegan because we've still got the vegans on side anyway. That's the attitude of some of the brands, but there's also this sense that it's a very boring term. It's kind of too safe, it doesn't mean anything. Whereas vegan might provoke some people, it also can provoke a very strong positive sentiment as well, which can kind of have this very strong brand loyalty. So it can kind of be the worst of both worlds if you go for plant-based. So most of the brands I would say are probably in this space, using both terms to try and capture the flexitarian, climatarian, reducitarian market, as well as the vegans and the vegetarians, of course. And when we're thinking about the vegan trademark specifically, that's where this can kind of come into it, because they talk about the vegan trademark. If you just put the word vegan on your product, a lot of brands with their own internal research or their own internal assumptions think that, okay, a lot of people will just take that at face value. But for the vegan consumer, that trademark is the gold standard. So it's really trusted. Whereas just putting the word vegan on the front of it or plant-based is not so, especially plant-based is not so trusted. Because plant-based at the moment, although it might not be the case anymore, but when I was doing this research, it wasn't a protected term. So anyone could just say plant-based and it could have like 49% meat in it, whereas obviously vegan has a kind of framework around it. So the ideal really is to use plant-based in some contexts, online for example, or on the packaging at the front, and then to use vegan in other contexts and to kind of try and do the best of both worlds. And what we've seen with that then, of course, is the emergence of all these other terms like plant-curious, plant-forward, flexitarian, climatarian, reducitarian, vegan-friendly, meat-free. Oh, and this was the most surprising for me. There's a lot of conflation between veganism and free-from. Like, a lot of the brands would say, the free-from market is what we want to get to, because the free-from market is kind of very well established. In any supermarket you go to, there'll be a free-from section, and it's kind of legitimate now. There is some debate there, interestingly, about whether brands want to have their separate vegan section, which is easy to find, or whether they would rather vegan products just be aligned next to the non-vegan options, so it's kind of normalized. So that's another debate that's going on within the brand interviews. So we've kind of got this third option, really, which if veganism is very animal-centric and plant-based is kind of pushing the animals off to the side, we've got this third option, which is like animal eccentric, you know, like just slightly off from the side. And the brands that seem to me to be trying to negotiate this space. They do want to promote veganism, especially some of the brands were owned by vegans, but they want to do so in a way that is going to encourage people to go vegan and stay vegan. And there is a lot of confusion around kind of what is the best theory of change around this. And as you can see, there's so many different styles of advertising nowadays. Some of these are actually from the Vegan Society archive. So on the left here, we've got some from the 50s. But going all the way up to the present day, we can see a lot of different approaches. Some are kind of very much challenging masculine stereotypes. Some are being kind of very fun and sarcastic. Some up here on the top right, I tried to be vegan, but last night I joined the Illuminati, you know, like kind of making it into, oh, don't worry if you fall off the tofu train, you can just get back on again. It's kind of this flexitarian branding. So we've got this kind of proliferation of adverts, and some of my colleagues and I are looking at this diversification at the moment. But the key point I'd say for this audience and for this project is really that the brands are very confused and would like some evidence-based guidance about what to do next. So that leads to part 2, which is we wanted to talk to consumers, but first we wanted to get a really good insight into kind of what the consumer culture is around this. What are consumers facing when they're trying to learn about plant-based and vegan diets, plant-based and vegan lifestyles, plant-based and vegan ideologies? How are they getting that information? If you type in plant-based or vegan, this is my Instagram, so obviously it might be different for you with the algorithm, but as you can see, it's quite hard to tell what the difference is. Some of these are vegan, some of these are plant-based. And the research very quickly showed that when it comes to searching, these two terms are almost synonymous. They'll bring up a lot of the same content, a lot of it about how to cook plant-based food, a lot of it how to cook vegan food. There's not really a key distinction in terms of the algorithm, at least not on the surface. So for example, here on the right, you can see the words vegan appear slightly more, but here in the middle, even if you search for vegan, it will still bring up plant-based content. So there's not kind of a sharp divide here. But if you look at social media influencers, it seems like there's a huge divide here. If you look for vegan, what you'll find is anti-vegan influencers like the one on the left will be saying about how oats are bad for you. And then there'll be vegan influencers on the right kind of making fun of them and saying how this isn't based in evidence or science. So I've put a picture here in the middle of this archipelago, right? The consumers are the average consumer is in the middle, but you've got these two very extreme polarized sides that seem to be separate islands that never touch. So depending on what your algorithm is feeding you depends on what you're going to see. And this is obviously very dangerous and why we need to kind of fill in the gap between. And there's lots of examples of this, like using generative AI to generate the image on the left, that you've got someone who eats meat is nice and muscly, and you've got Gollum as the vegan. But then the vegans kind of contrast that by saying, well, the carnivore is probably going to die first. So there is a lot of humour online, at least. Me to the vegans after leaving their cult. If you look very carefully, and the research that I'm doing at the moment says there's kind of 4 main approaches that emerge. There's 4 main patterns that emerge when you talk about vegan versus plant-based. Entertaining, educating, embodying, and equating. And I'll just briefly talk you through these. So if we look at these 4 different patterns, one of the most dominant ones is entertaining. Both sides, vegans and anti-vegans, tend to try to use humour to convert people to their side. So this guy tries the vegan challenge. He lasts 5 seconds and then gives up. And this is obviously very funny. Or Jeremy Clarkson saying vegans get very little sex. But vegan influencers will be kind of countering that content with humour as well. So we've got some allies online. From a vegan society perspective, maybe what's most interesting is that the educating influencers are growing rapidly. So there'll be a lot of people online posting about the dark side of veganism, how your hair's going to fall out, how your nails are going to fall off, your skin's going to get very spotty, or you might die. And then there's a lot of influencers out there who are actually kind of challenging this online. And the way that they do that, though, is by using peer-reviewed articles, interestingly enough, which as an academic is very interesting to me. So they'll actually find articles and they'll talk you through the article and interpret the article in an accessible 30-second segment, which is very interesting. But also the anti-vegans will be able to find their own research to try and back up their points. So again, it depends on where in the algorithmic bubble you're going to sit that what you're going to see. Equating's another interesting one. Anti-veganism tends to be very classist, sexist, ableist, racist, and so on. The vegan influencer movement seems to be very intersectional, so it tries to be anti-racist, feminist, promoting much more diverse ways of thinking. As you can see here, there was a whole discourse around oatmeal being for peasants, so you shouldn't eat porridge because it's for peasants, you know, and you don't want to be a peasant. I don't know if any of you know of Tash Peterson, but she obviously goes around in Australia and promoting veganism. And I don't know if you've seen this video, but someone comes over to her and says, well, if you're vegan, why are you so fat? And her response could have obviously been to kind of say like, oh, you know, that's awful or whatever. But no, she really challenges it on two bases. One that, you know, she kind of says, well, you're the same body shape as me, actually, so I don't really know why you're saying that. But secondly, there's nothing wrong with fat people, and kind of deconstructs this very kind of very sexist discourse in the first place. So again, you're seeing this kind of overlap between different liberation movements here emerging. And I think this is for two reasons. One, because a lot of vegans, the research suggests, tend to be very intersectional in their thinking. But two, because some argue for and some argue against this, but some argue that kind of connecting animal rights issues to other rights issues can allow people to make a connection. Other people obviously argue that can maybe dilute the animal issues. But at least in this case, there is this kind of logic that if we can connect, you know, you care about feminism, so if I can connect animals to that, then we can start to have a conversation around it. And finally, embodying. Obviously, this is Instagram, so it's not a surprise, but there's a lot of people online who say that vegan men, especially, are very weak and lack in muscles. So there's a lot of vegan male influencers who are very muscly and will basically just show the proof is in the pudding, right? So here we go. This is the muscle right here. Vegan 25 years, vegan 8 years, and I haven't died of, you know, protein deficiency yet. So there's this theme as well. The guy on the left is a animal hunter, so he does a lot of content around hunting animals. And then the guy on the right is a vegan influencer who tries to promote that you can be a bodybuilder without eating animal products. I'm going to whiz through this, but you tend to see mixtures of the two. So people who educate but in a fun way, people who try to make fun of other people but then put in some science as well. You'll also see people who try to show off that they've got this kind of great physique, but they'll do so in a way that is also very intersectional, rather than trying to reproduce kind of old-fashioned masculine tropes, for example. So the one at the bottom is, you know, like saying basically if you drink raw milk, you're going to get a woman and be able to lift her up because that's what she needs. Whereas the vegan influencer here is basically saying, well, you can have oat milk and have a more equitable relationship, you know. So again, you can have these mixtures as well. And some of them try to do all four at once as well. As you can see here, you know, kind of entertaining, this shirtless guy again, but then here's the science that kind of disproves it, and then here's my body, which I haven't died yet, this kind of thing. Now, the reason why this is all important as our second stage is because, as I said, the brands that we spoke to in the, let's just see, I've got a bit more time. The brands that we spoke to in the first phase had their points of view, but we said in the first report that these were all working assumptions because they were very much uncertain about what consumers actually thought. So they were just kind of trying to work their way through the vegan plant-based wilderness, making some assumptions, and they were drawing their assumptions from the news and what they saw in the discourse. But as we saw, that's very confused. So now we want to understand what consumers actually think. So the second stage is looking at, well, what are consumers exposed to? They're obviously exposed to mass media, but a lot of people get their news and information from social media nowadays. So having done a deep dive into social media, what we see is that whether you look for plant-based or vegan, you're going to get similar content. And depending on where your bubble is, well, how your bubble is constructed, you're going to see certain types of pro or anti-vegan content, as we saw here. But these are just the extreme islands on the archipelago. So we've kind of done this flyover of social media content. And when you look at social media, you're obviously going to see the extremes. When we're looking at the comments, you're also, when I researched the comments with the sentiment analysis, you tend to see people for or against. But what about all those consumers who don't comment but still have an opinion? Or those consumers who don't see this content but are still making choices in the marketplace? So the next stage is really to kind of land in the middle of these islands and to look at the consumers who are just kind of navigating the waters between pro-vegan and anti-vegan content, and to really understand kind of what the typical mainstream consumer thinks about these issues, and then what is going to draw them to one side or the other. And is it going to be a plant-based label? Is it going to be a vegan label? Or is it going to be something else? So the next stage that we've been talking about, we're still thinking about, so any advice or insight would be very welcome. We could, of course, do a consumer survey and kind of get that breadth that we're lacking at the moment. We could do more in-depth consumer interviews, really understand the kind of life cycle of a consumer, why they would go to veganism or not. And we can also maybe try some A/B testing, which is basically where you try different labels or different advertising, different variations on the same product, and you can see how consumers react to that. Now, most brands do this kind of in an automated fashion, so they'll just kind of send out adverts to people on social media, and depending on how people respond, they'll adapt in real time. During the Brexit vote, for example, a lot of people who showed an interest in animals would get animal-based content. You know, if we leave the EU, we can do this. If we leave the EU, we can do that, you know, about animals. Where someone who didn't care about animals would get completely different reasons to leave the EU. So A/B testing is very well established. What we would be more interested in is kind of a critical interpretive approach, which is, you know, trying to understand how consumers interpret it and then maybe having conversations around that in order to dig a bit deeper. Because there's a lot of people out there already using big data to answer these questions. We need some thick data to complement that. That's my presentation, so thank you very much. And I'm quite surprised I actually kept to time, so we've got 5 minutes if we need any. I think, do we have 5 minutes? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So if there's any questions, please raise your hands and I'll come over to you. John?
Thanks, Joe. Really interesting. I was wondering if you could say a few words about who the consumer is. Who do these brands, who is their imagined consumer in this? Obviously, social media content that goes out to specific individuals is based on an algorithm that's made assumptions about who that individual is, right? So everybody's getting a different sense of things from social media because the algorithms understand that everyone's different, and so that content's tailored. So when you're talking to these brands, who is their imagined consumer? Because consumer is such an enormous term, but like the context in which different people are making decisions and purchasing decisions about what to consume and when and where vary enormously. So does that come up in your conversations with them? Yeah,
definitely. I think that's the number one question. Maybe because I say I'm a consumer researcher, so they latch onto me. But for them, I think there's most of the brands, regardless of whether they're set up by a vegan or not, whether they label themselves as vegan or not, they tend to divide the market into two main camps, vegans and non-vegans. And the reason for that is because they think of the vegans as kind of converted. So, you know, whatever we sell to them, however it's labelled, as long as it is vegan, they're going to be potentially interested. The non-vegans, though, this is where the ideology comes in. The non-vegans bring with them all sorts of assumptions, speciesism, anthropocentrism, whatever it is, that biases their view. And the brands, from a commercial perspective, but also a culture change perspective, are thinking, okay, there's a huge spectrum of different consumers, but basically we want most or all of them to be able to buy our brand. So they kind of lump them all together generally as non-vegans. And these terms, flexitarian, climatarian, whatever it is, all kind of refer to people who are willing to try different products, but have these kinds of assumptions around what animal food is, or what it should be, or what it does. And therefore, they're trying to deconstruct that. But as a single brand, you can't do all that culture work. You can't challenge centuries, millennia of assumptions being built up. So the brand has to navigate that, and the best way to do that is to kind of think, okay, what's the safest option for all the non-vegans, whoever they are, their gender, their race, their economic background, how can we get to all of those people as much as possible? There were some slight variations, so some brands, you know, if it was a kind of high-end brand, obviously they would maybe be able to have a higher price point, and they might be able to target consumers from specific socioeconomic backgrounds, and that would adapt how they present themselves. But most of the brands I spoke to were mass market brands. And even the brands who were set up by a vegan, promoting a kind of, you know, very vegan if I want to put it this way, agenda. Very explicitly, we're kind of promoting vegan ideals. Even they were thinking about the non-vegan because, of course, that's who they want to try to win over. So there was this very interesting... I was imagining that they'd have this really complicated segmentation tool. And they kind of... Some of them did, but most of them were very much just kind of thinking, well, we need to just have something that appeals to everyone as a mass market term. You know, because if we target this one group really well, then we're going to exclude all these other people. And we need this product to be mass market appeal, to have this mass market appeal. So they were trying to find a way of being able to have that homogeneous marketing approach. So it was very old-fashioned, really. It's mass marketing that they went for. But I did not speak to any brands per se that were just trying to target just vegans. And I never spoke to any brands that said we want to just target this one really specific group. So maybe I'll find that in the future. But yeah, that is a very interesting question. So we got 2 more questions? Okay, we'll have the questions afterwards.
Sorry.
Sorry, I spent so long answering that one question that I didn't get more. So I'll talk to you afterwards if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.